On this week's 51%, we speak with filmmaker Tracy Heather Strain about her new PBS documentary Zora Neale Hurston, Claiming a Space, recognizing the renowned writer's groundbreaking anthropological research and impact on Black folklore.
Many of the stories and sayings she collected have become a part of the American lexicon.
Our associate producer Jody Cowan also speaks with artist Kelli Rae Adams about her current installation at Mass MoCA. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. I'm Jessie King. Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is a longtime filmmaker, producer, writer, and educator at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Tracy Heather Strain has directed several documentaries for series like PBS's American Experience. She says she is drawn to stories that showcase how race, gender, and sexuality intersect to shape personal and societal narratives. Her latest, produced by her partner and colleague Randall McLowry, is a 2-hour feature on African-American writer Zora Neale Hurston. The film, titled Zora Neale Hurston, Claiming a Space, premiered on American Experience on January 17th. Hurston was a key figure of the 19th century's Harlem Renaissance, who is now best remembered for her literary work, particularly the 1937 novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. Despite that, she died in relative obscurity in 1960, but Strain says we're in the midst of a Hurston revival, with some of her previously unpublished works, including Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo, based on her 1927 interviews with Middle Passage survivor Cudjoe Lewis, released in just the past few years. Claiming a Space particularly focuses on Hurston's trailblazing work as an anthropologist, studying her own people in the American South and later rural black communities in the Caribbean. In fighting for her own place in the field, Hurston became a foremost authority on Black folklore and consistently challenged the field's assumptions about race, gender, and cultural superiority. Strain notes that there's so many layers to Hurston's life. We could talk about Hurston for hours, but we covered what we can for the show here.
Anthropology is a discipline that was started as a way of studying other cultures, right? Other peoples. It's considered a part of the colonial enterprise. People going around the world, look at these people over here. Oh, look at how they're interesting and different. And a lot of the people that were studied, depending, where we're talking about, and well, most of the places we're talking about, were looked upon as less civilized than the white Westerners who were traveling to those places. And so to have Zora Neale Hurston come in decades later, century later, depending on where you count the beginning of anthropology, to be looking at African Americans, Black people, this was revolutionary. She wasn't the only one doing it, but she was one of the few African Americans doing it at the time. She wasn't the only African American, but one of the only African Americans. And she particularly was interested in the South, which was very much looked down upon. People thought that there was no culture there, or if there was culture, it was set in stone and almost like pre-modern, and it was unchanging. And she demonstrated that that wasn't the case. And the other part to this is the way she gained people's trust. She went down there originally thinking, oh, she'll use the techniques and tools she learned at Barnard from Franz Boas and his colleagues. And she writes that, oh, when I used my Barnardese to ask, is there any folklore here? People were like, no folklore here. Try someplace else. Maybe they have it. And she knew they had stories. And so she changed her methodology, and she actually, told some lies about who she was, because she also had a car, right? Suddenly, here's a Black woman in the 20s with a car and is walking around with a film camera and asking about stories. And so she said she was, in a couple of cases, she said she was a bootlegger, and she was on the lam to make people feel comfortable, to get inside. I'm under the impression that she then did kind of come clean. But, once they knew her and felt comfortable around her, and then she had to participate to make people feel comfortable. And that's what we demonstrate in the film. For me, it's one of the most fun parts of the film, where she's like seeing people making folklore with Langston Hughes's poems.
When we talk about the folklore she was collecting, could you elaborate a little bit on the importance of that? Like, how does folklore contribute to an overall culture?
Well, a lot of what is considered American culture comes from African Americans. And I think that many of the stories and sayings that she collected have become a part of the American lexicon. I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this seemingly fearless woman went on her own to go get this stuff, to say, look, this isn't just talk here. This is culture. This is important. These people are important. Their lives are important. And they have something beautiful that they've added and continue to add to American culture.
Well, I think the title of the film really hits the nail on the head. Like, you really do get the sense that Hurston is someone who had to go out and work for every opportunity she encountered. She had to stake her claim in her field. And even when she would find an opportunity or find a patron, she'd still have to maneuver around them in order to do the research that she really wanted to do.
Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston's really inspiring to me. She's this woman that made these decisions at the time. First of all, from a very young age, when she was primarily on her own at age 13, and had this yearning to continue to get an education, a formal education. I think she was getting lots of life lessons. We don't really know everything that was going on in her life between like 13 and 26, but she managed to get a high school education, then go on to Howard and then Barnard, and then discovers anthropology, continues learning through her field work, starts working on a PhD, kind of starts working on a PhD, and that doesn't work out. But she didn't let things stop her. When she got her first rejection from the Guggenheim Foundation, she didn't roll up in a ball and say no, right? Yo, woe is me. She tried again later, and then she ends up getting 2 Guggenheims back to back. I just find her really inspiring. And as someone who makes documentaries and we have to raise money and you have to apply for grants, and those rejections come in, you kind of feel badly for yourself. And I think I'm going to use Zora Neale Hurston as a reminder. It's like, just get up and just try again. And also to not be afraid to try things that seem like they might be out of reach. She just went for it.
You mentioned Franz Boas a little earlier. He was Hurston's academic advisor or professor, maybe mentor, you could say. And there's a point in the documentary where he could have helped her get the Guggenheim the first time around, but he doesn't. And it feels like such a betrayal. Like, what do we know about her relationship with Boas and with her patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason? Like, what happened there?
Yeah, I feel like it was very hard for us to know for sure what the relationship was like, because we don't have all of Zora Neale Hurston's papers. And so we can only piece together things and infer some things. And so it seems like Franz Boas thought she was a good person and a skilled person to go down and collect folklore. But with the help with our interviewees, it seems that maybe the rest of the people at Columbia didn't really see her as the person to be doing the analysis, the person that was equipped to do the heavy lifting, the thinking, right? So when they write to the Guggenheim Foundation and basically say that she isn't the right caliber for a Guggenheim, it is very shocking because he has presented himself to her, as far as we know, as a supporter. So it's very confusing how to think of that. And so you have to ask yourself, where does race fall into this? Gender? I mean, he's a big supporter of women. So you kind of think, well, maybe is it gender? Is it race? What is going on? And what role does Zora Neale Hurston play herself in that? When I think about someone who was on her own since 13, trying to do all the things that she's done, and didn't really have the kind of mentor that she really needed, the one that was going to get into the nitty gritty with her and kind of constantly have her back. She never had that in her life. And then Charlotte Osgood Mason, as one of our interviewees says, she was a handful. It seems like there were a number of white women who were in Harlem supporting African-American writers, artists, and she facilitated Zora Neale Hurston's second trip to the South, which is where we have all this footage, why we have this footage that she shot, and some other material. There's the 6,000 photos she talks about. No one knows what happened to them. It's sort of sad to think about that. But I think she was difficult because she thought Zora Neale Hurston was an employee working for Charlotte Osgood Mason and didn't have control over the material she was getting. So she was like torn between trying to get what she wanted to get, trying to do things in a way that would please Franz Boas, but also she had this contract with Charlotte Osgood Mason, a contract that provided her a car, $200 a month. And so it was so intense and stressful.
What was her relationship like with some of the other figures of the Harlem Renaissance? We know she connected with Langston Hughes for a period. Was she like an involved part of that movement?
Zora Neale Hurston met Langston Hughes at the first Opportunity Awards dinner in 1925. Beyond that, we don't know much about their relationship. The next time I know for sure when they were together was when she runs into him on her first trip down south in 27, and they go driving around and hanging out together. She goes to turpentine camps, they meet Ethel Waters, they do all these fun things. I think that she had a challenging relationship with people. Some people really loved her, and some people did not like her. She was Southern. They say she was funny. She wasn't ashamed of her Southernness, as one of the interviewees says in the film. And if you think about the fact that there are people trying to run away from their Southernness, as part of the Great Migration, they're trying to, like this one interviewee says, slough off, the old Negro, because we're in the midst of this new Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, as it later became known as. I think she had a very complicated relationship. And in the end, which we don't get into in the film, she left. She didn't feel like this was the place for her. And she spent a lot of time in Florida and other places.
So how did her anthropological work factor into her literary work, particularly in Their Eyes Were Watching God?
Their Eyes Were Watching God is a mix of Hurston's personal experiences, memory, and her ethnographic work. You can see evidence of things that she collected in Their Eyes Were Watching God. The anthropologist Lee Baker calls he describes some sections as thick description because it's really rich with details. It's an interesting mix of poetry, literature, and very specific representations of Black culture. That's actually one of our favorite, for some of the people in the project, that part of the film is one of our favorite parts of the film. We worked really hard to try to have the audience experience this notion of what she was doing with this work, mixing what she had seen with what she felt and remembered with beautiful words and imagery. And so I don't know how you felt about if you saw that section of the film, but that's one of our favorite sections because it's all coming together. And even though it didn't sell well at the time, you can see why it became the successful book it did later.
You certainly do get that feeling of like, okay, everything's coming together. But as you said, the book wasn't really received the way it is today. It didn't make as much money as Hurston was perhaps hoping, and it actually received its fair share of criticism from other writers, particularly Black male writers of the time. In his review, Richard Wright said, quote, "Miss Hurston seems to have no desire whatsoever to move in the direction of serious fiction," end quote. What do you think that was about? Do you attribute it a little bit maybe to what you described earlier of people just trying to distance themselves from Southern Black culture?
I think a couple of things are going on. I think there's some serious sexism going on there. And I think there's a dismissal of a focus on a woman. For what Richard Wright said about Zora Neale's writing means that he wasn't actually trying to understand what she was doing or just wanted to be mean. I feel like what she's saying about this Black woman's life, along with other Black women who are in the story, is very political. And I do think she tackles racism, but her book came out at a time when what was in vogue was more hard-hitting attacks on racism. This book is often considered one of the last books of the Harlem Renaissance. I basically feel that the attacks on Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, by Black male writers, including Richard Wright, were really sexist. And I think that, I don't know if they were intentionally trying to misread, the politics and the gendered stories that were there, but they were also dismissive of stories about women's lives, I believe. And I saw this with Lorraine Hansberry. A Raise in the Sun was kind of dismissed by some people. Oh, it's just a, what do they call it? A kitchen sink drama, right? And so I think that happens to women's work a lot.
Well, that said, do you have a favorite work of Hurston's?
I don't know if there's one particular work that's my favorite. There's several quotes that I like that they come from all different sources, and many of them are in the film. But there are some essays that she wrote that we couldn't put in the film, like the title essay of the book "You Don't Know Us Negroes." That's in 34. She wrote an essay called that, and I had worked to try to get that in the documentary, but it was too difficult. Sometimes things are too abstract, to visualize for a documentary of this type. So that was one article I liked. It wasn't published at the time. I was amazed at how much wasn't published. And that's why a book like You Don't Know Us Negroes is so important and Barracoon. I mean, look at Barracoon. She tries to get it published in 31. It doesn't get published until 2018.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your process as a director. What kind of work goes into a film like this?
First of all, I made this film with a team. I didn't do it alone. The process we went through is very much what we do for all our documentaries that are historical. And I'll just slide this over. This is just a small sampling of some of this. We have shelves and shelves of books. We have all of the books out of Wesleyan's library about Zora Neale Hurston. So we start with research. We do secondary source research first. So here's like Valerie Boyd's book, Wrapped in Rainbows, which is a great source for us. And what we do, which is not something I did when I was a student, was we actually read the footnotes and look and see where the sources are for things. If you read something and someone mentions there was a photograph or a camera or something, we look for those things literally. We look at the acknowledgments and find out what archives they got their information from. We contact all of those people and we organize it all in a database. We have advisors, the scholars, we talk with some of the authors who write all those books and ask them questions and help them. And then during the process of making it, we check in with some of the advisors to see if it's accurate, if the writing is accurate, if we've made unintended inferences with something we put on the screen, if there's a problem with a certain image. So I don't do it alone.
Well, congrats. What do you hope viewers take away from this film?
I hope that for viewers that have never heard of Zora Neale Hurston, that this documentary will get them excited about learning more. And for viewers who know about Zora Neale Hurston, I truly hope that the film is a moving experience and that they too have learned something that they didn't know about this fascinating woman. She continued to impress me. And I could have made a series about Zora Neale Hurston and not have been bored, and I guarantee you we could have made it interesting for an audience as well, because there's so much you can say about her.
Tracy Heather Strain is the director of Zora Neale Hurston, Claiming a Space, which premiered January 17th on PBS's American Experience. You can check your local PBS station to see when it's airing near you, or learn more at pbs.org. Tracy, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much.
I don't know about you, but for me, the winter months always seem like a good time to hit the art museum. Up next, we have a conversation with artist Kelli Rae Adams, a ceramicist who uses clay and other materials to explore subjects like consumption, capitalism, and labor. With her MFA in ceramics from the Rhode Island School of Design, Adams has been showcasing her work nationally and internationally since 2007. Currently, she's a featured exhibitor at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. Her installation, Forever in Your Debt, visualizes the financial burden of American student loan debt, an average of $37,000 per individual, with more than 900 wheel-thrown bowls lined up across the floor, filled with loose change. Our associate producer, Jody Cowan, spoke with Adams about her inspiration for the project and how it came together.
So the installation is essentially a physical illustration of the student debt crisis in the United States. I decided to do this by making a massive quantity of handmade bowls, which I produced on the potter's wheel in a tradition that I learned in Japan in the early 2000s. And so there are about 925 bowls in the installation, which per my calculation should hypothetically be enough to hold the average individual student debt burden, $37,000, in the form of coins. And I am slowly gathering that much coin from visitors and contributors to the installation.
How did you decide on this particular visual layout, and has this setup changed as you've shown it in other spaces?
So this installation's been interesting in that regard. I've shown it at about 3 or 4 places prior to Massimoka. I was kind of touring it around the country a little bit in the few months that actually were leading up to the onset of the pandemic. And I had been planning to try to situate it in cities that were sort of prominent points on the campaign trail in the run-up to the 2020 election. So that plan was foiled by the pandemic. But in each of those prior installations, every space was different. And one of the things that I was really excited about with respect to this work is that it easily shapeshifts and it easily inhabits different spaces. I've always been attached to the idea in some sense of it being on the floor. I think there's kind of a humility in that positioning, and I think it's unexpected in some way. It would feel, I think, also a bit contrived to me to take this very domestic, humble object and place it on a pedestal, and also the pedestal itself would have to be massive in this case. So all of that to me feels like an unnecessary layer, and I think there is a kind of strength in positioning them, at this lower level that we don't typically see in art museum and in gallery spaces.
You mentioned studying in Japan. How is it you got involved in studying the craft of pottery there?
I had studied art in undergrad. I was mostly in sculpture. I had an excellent professor and mentor in sculpture. But I finally found my feet there and fell in love with welding, I would say, and metalwork, and then went to Japan really primarily because I wanted to continue exploring languages. I wanted to live abroad, and I arrived there and really, had never really been interested in ceramics. But once there, I started noticing the beautiful handmade ceramics that people use in their homes on a daily basis. And for the first time really in my life was kind of captivated by ceramics and pottery. And so I thought, okay, well, while I'm here, I should perhaps try something local, and started asking around for a teacher and found my way to Genki, as he was called. Tetsuro Hatabe was actually his full name. But he is an incredible ceramicist and was a wonderful teacher. And yeah, I think for me, it was a completely unexpected experience that, looking back now, fully redirected my creative path. And I ended up being there for 3 years while on the teaching program. I was very focused on paying down my student debt. I did manage to pay off my undergrad debt in those 3 years of teaching. And then I ended up going back to do an apprenticeship with my sensei there for 2 years. And that was in that instance, my life sort of inverted in a way. I was teaching part-time to support myself, and then spending my days at the ceramics studio.
You work with clay in various forms and use the themes of labor, capitalism, and consumption. This latest installation, Forever in Your Debt, is described as a material data visualization. How do you describe the art that you make and the type of artist that you are?
I feel like it changes every time I describe it, because I think, certainly it can be described as ceramics. It can be described even as pottery. And yet, there is this layering that I'm playing with. And I think I perhaps use the word installation art, but I think that's also can sometimes be a little bit obtuse for someone who's receiving that word. So I feel like every time I describe it, I probably describe it differently. I am starting with an idea or a concern or a question. I think for me, and I think that is something that I realized when I was in grad school, that as opposed to being perhaps a maker thinker. This was the sort of terminology I came up with for it. Somebody who arrives somewhere through the act of making. I usually am starting with a particular idea. I feel like I'm a thinker maker. I'm starting with this idea, and then I'm really sitting in the question of how I can best translate it. And so then the act of translation really becomes more of an execution, in the studio that I have a goal in mind and I'm making my way there. And certainly there are sometimes unexpected detours along the way, but usually it is more of the fact that I'm carrying an idea and oftentimes waiting for an opportunity to bring it into being.
Another profound theme of your work is the idea of impermanence and erasure. People have the opportunity to donate change and receive one of your bowls for themselves after the span of the installation, which enables your work as it is to both disappear and find new life. Where does that idea come from for you?
I'm always thinking about the afterlife of the project. How is it going to live when it's no longer in the museum or in the gallery? And so when I had this idea to make this massive quantity of bowls, I was sitting in that question of how am I going to fill them? How am I going to generate that amount of coin? And then I was also facing this question of, and what will I do with them after? And so, and in some sense, the marriage of those two concerns became the perfect vehicle for collaboration and participation, right? So that this idea that those who contribute will eventually receive one of the bowls, it gives the bowls a purpose, after they have served this one, which is, to go and live in people's homes. And I don't know, maybe they will have their soup out of them, or maybe they will use them as a coin vessel in their own home. And so, but I would say one of the primary drivers of that is this concern with making more stuff on the planet and wanting to be very mindful about that and wanting to be considerate of how I am approaching that in my practice. So through collaboration, we can actually sometimes avoid the expected outcome and maybe preserve things that might have otherwise been wasted.
Your current work is listed to be on display at Mass MoCA until May of 2023. What's next for you?
Well, I will say they've actually extended the work. It will be there at least through the summer, if not longer. And I will also be there for the free day on January 28th. But as for what's next, so this coming week, I'm actually relocating to New York. I will be there for a fellowship at the Bard Graduate Center. This is a research-based fellowship called the Fields of the Future Fellowship. And I will be there primarily sort of investigating, looking at, learning more about ancient currencies. I've had some ideas emerge with respect to income inequality and wage disparity, and I'm interested in using these certain ancient forms of currency to illustrate those phenomena. So I will be doing a deeper dive into those essentially ancient clay forms, but how to sort of investigate how I might adapt those to be illustrative devices of sorts to talk about these more contemporary issues.
Finally, who is the "you're" in Forever in Your Debt?
It's a good question. I suppose the way that the current system is construed, we set up a situation in which those who are starting out, those who are learning, those who are sort of just emergent adults are, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, are forever indebted to those who are lending, who are offering this education. And I wonder if there isn't a more productive positioning to establish that would allow, instead of this burdened posture, moving out into the world from a burdened posture, what if we somehow were able to flip that, so that someone who's at that precipice, who's just stepping into the world, is doing so from a much more liberated place. I think we all stand to benefit from that if we could somehow manifest that, because I think the freedom of thought, the freedom of creativity that comes from that kind of stance is one of the intangibles that gets squashed, I think, by this current system.
That was artist Kelli Rae Adams speaking with our associate producer, Jody Cowan. Her installation, Forever in Your Debt, is on view now at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts. You can learn more at massmoca.org, or Kelli Rae Adams has her own website. That is kelliraeadams.com. You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. A big thanks to Tracy Heather Strain and Kelli Rae Adams for taking the time out of their busy schedules to speak with us this week. To learn more about our guests and the show, check us out at WAMCpodcast.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hall